we know that there are certain things that increase the likelihood of one winning a fight.
Mhm.
What are those things?
So the main thing, and this is generally where what we talk about when I give this talk, the main thing is what I call aliveness. And what works when I first started martial arts when I was a kid, what I was obsessed with was what works and what doesn't work in an actual fight. And make a long story short, the martial arts that work, the functional martial arts, all have one thing in common, which is they all tend to be combat sports. So boxing, wrestling, Muay Thai, Brazilian Jiu-jitsu, Sambo, these are all combat sports in addition to being martial arts. And because they're combat sports, uh, the consequences of training matter. They wanted to win. You want to be able to compete. You have to actually be able to physically do what you claim to do. If you're, for example, going to compete in judo, you have to actually be able to throw people and not get thrown. Unlike Aikido, where it's all make believe. And so, with that sport basis, they have a form of competition and they have a live training where you're working with resisting opponents, you're working with training partners who are going to give you realistic energy, and you build on that over time, and you can learn how to fight. And all functional martial arts have that in common, and all fantasy-based martial arts, make-believe martial arts, which, as you mentioned, is a huge percentage. The superstition in the martial arts is massive. They all have in common a lack of that very thing, a lack of aliveness. And instead of working with resisting opponents and building with adaptive resistance, it's memorizing dead patterns and choreography, basically. So where one person pretends to attack and the other person then pretends to counter. And so the distinction is aliveness. And that's also where martial arts and what you do in critical thinking meet up, because in that sense, what matters more than the answer is how you arrived at that answer. And what matters more here is the training method that the athletes are using. And if they're training in a functional way, then ultimately they're going to come out on the other end with something that looks somewhat similar to modern mixed martial arts.
Okay, so there's a lot there to unpack. One of the things that I've tried to do in this class, we missed 2 days of it, but one of the things I've tried to do when I teach this class is to give people tools that they can use to figure stuff out themselves. Because I'm only with them for 10 weeks, or in this case, 8 weeks.
Right.
And so when they leave me, they need to be able to figure out, oh, like my nephew wants to study whatever it is, like, is this malarkey or is this going to help her win a fight or prevent from being raped, or whatever the objective is.
Right.
And so I was wondering if you could tell people how to figure out when they go to a studio or when they see something, what is reality based and what is make believe land.
Mm-hmm. Well, first thing you want to do is just a little bit of education on what the martial arts are and get a basic background for what different martial arts systems are. And you're going to want to go, if you want to practice a martial art that's going to work, because you want to be able to defend yourself, you want to be able to develop real confidence because of a measurable skill that you acquire through working hard, you're going to want to go to one version or another of a combat sport. That doesn't mean that you're preparing for a competition. You may never want to compete, and you may be training specifically for self-defense, but you're still going to want to work Brazilian Jiu-jitsu on the ground and a boxing structure for standing and some form of clinch so that you can maintain distance and range and stay on your feet. So stand-up clinch and ground from the combat sports. So that's the first thing, is you can separate the martial arts right away just by talking about what is a combat sport and what isn't. And when you're looking at a demonstration like what we watched here, or any martial arts demonstration, one of the things I tell people to always do is don't look at the person who's doing the technique, because the person who's doing the technique will always look awesome. You know, just like movie choreography, the actor always looks awesome. You have to look at the person that's attacking them. So if you look at in most fantasy-based martial arts, they all do basically the same thing, where the person will pretend to throw a punch or pretend to come in. Like in Aikido, they'll run forward and pretend to hit him in the head, but then they just basically take a fall for the person that's performing the technique, or they lock their arm out and let the person that's performing the technique do 3 or 4 cool looking movements. But if you just watch the feeder, not the demonstrator, but the person that's feeding the demonstrator, and just watch their movement and just say, is that anything remotely realistic? If I was ever to have to use this martial art against somebody with bad intentions, would it look anything like that? Would it be even remotely close to that? And if the answer is no, then you're probably talking about a fantasy-based martial art.
Yeah, I'm always amazed. I have my own speculation for why this is, but I'm always amazed that people engage in these martial arts where they spend time and money and effort.
Mm-hmm.
And I wonder, let me ask you, I think I know the answer, and I think you're going to say, what percentage of the people at the upper levels of these martial arts, and I know that this is a generalization, like the one punch knockout guys, do these guys actually believe that stuff? And if they do, then why doesn't somebody go and, what is it, UFC, whatever it is now, if this stuff actually worked, they'd be winning fights with it.
Yeah.
So at some level, they have to know that this is make believe, right? Or no?
Yes and no. I think the percentage of people who are truly fooling themselves and making a living at it has grown smaller because of the UFC. So when the UFC first started, I think it was 1992, somewhere in there, early 90s. It was martial arts style versus martial arts style. So you'd have a kung fu person or a karate person fighting against a kickboxer or Royce Gracie who was doing, representing Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. And there were people, I remember back then, who thought, legitimate traditional martial artists, people who had come from fantasy-based martial arts, who thought that they could do it. And they entered the UFC, and of course they got beaten by one of the combat athletes or by Royce. We don't do that anymore because, it's not a sport, then it's a beating. If you take somebody from one of those arts and you put them up against a modern MMA athlete, it's just going to look like somebody getting beat up. But the sport of MMA has grown to such an extent, and so many people know about it now, that I think it's much harder to be that delusional. But I mean, if you really set your mind to being delusional, you're gonna stick with it.
Sorry, I was muted. But what I don't understand is there are so many. In fact, next to Straight Blast in Portland, there's that small circle jujitsu place. I shouldn't call people up, but maybe I should. I don't know. And then the whole Taekwondo thing and the whole I mean, it's so astonishing to me that you train people to keep their hands down. It's
Yeah.
like the worst possible thing you could do, and yet you go. And so something that I think, and you chime in on this, please, is you would be better off not knowing anything than training yourself to keep your hands down.
Yeah. So there's a common saying that I've heard other martial arts instructors use that I dislike a great deal. And the saying is, all arts have something good. All martial arts have something good to offer. You shouldn't be putting down any particular martial art. That's just not true. As somebody that's coached martial arts for a long time, I can tell you that it's much easier for me to train someone functional fighting skill when they have no background than it is to train somebody that comes to me with a previous background from a fantasy-based martial art, because they're going to have developed bad habits. So you can actually make yourself worse. Like anything else, if you're training in something that doesn't actually conform to reality, then you wind up going down some rabbit holes and wasting a tremendous amount of time. So I'd always prefer someone that came to me with no background over somebody that came to me with years and years of fantasy-based art.
Okay. Would you agree then to this claim? All martial arts have something to offer as long as winning a fight isn't taken into consideration.
I'd 100% agree to that. Yeah.
Because I know you can get really good workouts from many of these things.
Good workouts, and some of them have, cultural application or dance, or people can use it for forms of meditation and all that. I have no issue with any of that. The only time it becomes problematic is when the instructor is telling students a lie and telling them this is something you can use to defend yourself, and then they wind up getting in an altercation with football player or something like that and finding out very quickly that you can.
Yeah, just a quick side note. When my dad was still alive, he used to do Tai Chi, and he invited me to his Tai Chi class with all these senior citizens. Holy moly, I was sweating like a dog at the end of that 45. I mean, that is some difficult. That is like, I was totally taken aback by how difficult that was. And I was in much better shape than I was. And so, I mean, I looked at that. I was delighted my dad was doing that. Senior citizen, terrific exercise, wiped me out. But that's different from making a claim about reality that you can
Right.
win.
Right.
And so that's the problem, is that people cross the line from this is great exercise, or that's the other thing that I found. It's a tremendous community of people.
Mm-hmm.
And the thing that I found, and I'm curious, and I think it may be one of the things that ropes them in. You said something once, I don't want to get the quotation wrong, but you said something like, the longer you've been in an art that you realize is just simply not true, the more you have to make up for that slack by like ussing and bowing and being a dick, basically, because you can't rely upon the skills that took you there in the first place.
Right. Yeah, it's not uncommon if you go into some schools that teach a lot of fantasy-based martial arts to see a tremendous amount of ego there, but it's also, I don't think, much of a mystery why that happens. If you get somebody who maybe is attracted to martial arts initially because they were picked on or something like that, they're a little bit insecure to begin with, they get into a fantasy-based system and they develop a false sense of security. And maybe they don't realize it's all make-believe, like this guy did that got punched in the nose. But more likely, after investing a number of years and becoming part of this community and gaining accolades and working their way up through the system, they realize it doesn't actually work. And now they're still just as scared and insecure as they started, because they haven't really developed any real functional skill. And you can't fool yourself about that. But they now have this big lie that they have to defend. They have to go around and defend a position that's basically indefensible. So they go from being scared and kind of paranoid to being scared, paranoid, and dicks. Whereas if you take that same person and you put them in a functional martial art, in a very short period of time, I've seen people with all kinds of that, come through the door with all kinds of backgrounds and all kinds of issues and all kinds of problems. But what happens is, like anything truly athletic and truly physical, after a couple of years, you start to get more comfortable with your body and you start to get more comfortable with physical contact. You realize what you're capable of, and you also, and just as importantly, realize what you're not capable of.
Exactly.
And you develop a real sense of confidence that can't be faked any more than you can fake being able to play the guitar, being able to fake speaking a language. Martial arts is like that. When you can actually do it, you can do it, and there's no way to get around that reality. And that reality is priceless when it comes to people's confidence.
Yeah, I want to say one thing that I hear frequently that I don't really even get it. It's so unless I'm misunderstanding it, it's like you just don't want the one punch knockout to work, or the no touch knockout. Like you just don't want it. Now here's the video evidence of this, but correct me if I'm wrong, but if somebody walked into the studio and said, you know what, I have developed a one touch knockout and I can knock out anybody in here, you would not say, well, what would you say?
Show me, let's see. Conor got paid $100 million for his fight, his boxing match. If you can knock somebody out with one punch and we can show it to them, we're all going to make a whole lot of money. let's see it.
Right. So and you would have them demonstrate it. And if that worked, why on earth wouldn't you use it?
You cut out on me there for a second, but
yeah, sorry. If someone came in and they were demonstrating to your satisfaction,
yeah,
they started white belts, blue belts, purple belts, and then next thing you know, they're knocking out all the black belts without touching them, you'd be like, holy shit.
Yeah.
I'm going to use, all my guys are now going to be trained in this technique and we're just going to rule the world.
Sure.
I mean,
And
why would you want to do that?
that's how our curriculum developed. I mean, I went from wanting to do martial arts to boxing because it was what I felt was the most functional martial art for striking that there was when I was a young man. And then I ran into Gracie Jiu-Jitsu people. I ran into Fabio Santos and Rickson Gracie, who just effortlessly took me down and submitted me over and over again and choked.
And you're a big guy too.
Yeah, and they're a lot smaller. And I realized, wow, this is awesome. I have no idea what they're doing. This is a whole world that I know nothing about. I immediately jumped into it and started training. That was 30 years ago that happened. And about 3 or 4 years after I've been teaching and doing Gracie Jiu-Jitsu and boxing, I have a guy like Randy Couture come in the door and introduce. I understood wrestling, but I didn't understand how nuanced and technical the clinch could be when it's done by somebody like Randy or Dan Henderson, guys that really are masters of Greco-Roman wrestling. That's a whole piece we're missing. I don't know those things. And then we add that and adapt that to the curriculum. And that's what it's all about. So if somebody comes through the door and they have something like that to offer, of course we would jump on it. Not just me, but
Anybody.
entire industry.
To be sure.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. So that's kind of all I had. Is I just wanted to pick your brain so that people know. And if you're just joining us, two people join us in the science and pseudoscience class. One of the things we try to do is we talked about tools for differentiating reality from make-believe land. In this case, it's pretty easy. You just put people in a cage and you see of the same weight and you just see what happens.
Mhm.
And superstition, and not only one punch knockouts, it's too bad that other video didn't work, but of people, I think a lot of it myself, and I could be wrong about this, is people just want shortcuts. They don't want to put in the hard work, getting someone on top off of you who's on top of you, or of taking a blow or whatever it is. But all right, let me do this. I want to open this up more broadly. And again, if you came in late, Matt Thornton, his bios in the chat box, and we're talking about. He mentioned different ways to differentiate reality from make-believe land in the martial arts and superstition. He talked about aliveness. He talked about process. Watch the feeder, not the person doing the choreography. All right, so we'll open it up. Questions?
Good question. So how you would apply this epistemology to a kid's class? Well, even when we're talking about adults, I'm not suggesting ever that that anybody has to get beat up. The brilliant thing about, I'll use Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu as an example because it's such a good one, is someone who's good at Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu can physically dominate another human being, somebody that's bigger and stronger, on the mat without hurting them. You can hold someone down, you can control them, you can show them that there's nowhere they can go, and you can reverse the situation and have them attempt to hold you and show them that you can pretty much do whatever you want without anyone getting hurt. It's not like you have to strike them or knock them unconscious. So grappling has that one great advantage. So there's that aspect of it. But when it comes to kids classes, the what we do for kids is exactly what we do for the adults. And kids love grappling. Kids love much of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu comes naturally to kids in a way it doesn't really come to adults. So being able to play on the ground, being able to move around. I mean, if you walk into a legitimate Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu kids program, you should see kids working with each other and having contact with each other and doing alive drills and moving around on the mat. And yeah, it's honestly, in that sense, it's not very different from the way we would measure for an adult class. So when I first started martial arts training, one of the arts that I became an instructor in before I kind of moved myself more into Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu was Jeet Kune Do concepts, which is based in large part on some Chinese Kung Fu and Wing Chun in particular. I think that there is speaking bluntly, an enormous amount of superstition in Chinese Kung Fu and in Chinese martial arts. And I know there's a gentleman over there, a mixed martial arts gentleman, who's going around and doing challenge matches and bringing more functional training there. I know he's also not popular right now with the government because of what he's doing, but I think over time, given a few more years, that market in terms of functional martial arts is going to open up wide, partially because of MMA and uh, the popularity of it. But no, Japanese martial art. I don't think there's anything unique about Chinese martial arts in that sense. Japanese martial arts, Korean martial arts, Chinese martial arts, they all have an enormous amount of make believe in them. And there are their functional systems. Obviously, judo is from Japan. Uh, Brazilian jiu-jitsu is an offshoot of Japanese jiu-jitsu that was trained slightly differently before the war. Every warrior culture on earth has a grappling art. So there's Mongolian grappling and there's Icelandic grappling, and there are systems within Chinese martial arts that I think are really functional and useful and interesting that have been around a long time. But as a whole, and I don't know the historical reason for this, or whether it goes back to the Boxer Rebellion or something else, but as a whole, there is a great deal of superstition there in martial arts as well. It can look really obvious, kind of like some of the videos that Peter showed, where somebody pretends they can knock somebody down without touching them. That's a popular one, and they'll go like this, and their students will fall down, or they'll pretend that they can touch people and knock them out with one touch. But then when someone goes in there who's not their student, it doesn't work. And so all these things are one of the beautiful things about martial arts, that makes it, I think, a little bit different from some other fields of investigation or fields of knowledge, is it's so easily testable. If someone claims they can knock someone out without touching them, we can so easily test that, and we have, and so far that's never happened. So that would be an obvious one. With martial arts, it becomes a little more deceptive because instead of something obvious like that, you can have someone attack in a very unrealistic way. Like a classic one, what I mentioned before, was somebody would just hold their arm out like this. So they'll throw a punch, but then they kind of freeze in midair. And and you can get very good. You can look like you can fight really well because you can get very good at choreography at then responding to what is a completely unrealistic motion. And so that's where martial arts can be a little more deceptive. I've seen people, very bright people, very smart people, even athletes sometimes will look at phony martial arts and say, wow, that looks really cool. And it does look really cool. But again, you have to look at the person that's doing the attacking, not the person that's not the quote unquote defender. Look at the person who's feeding the instructor. And you can see pretty much right away that it's make believe. And to give you one more example, I would use Aikido, which is a beautiful looking martial art. And when Steven Seagal does it in a movie, it can look really cool. But when you actually watch what the people are doing to each other, there's nothing realistic about the motion. I'm not saying that someone should really attack them or has to like try and knock them out or tackle them, but the movement should be somewhat realistic. Nobody is ever going to try and punch you in the head and then freeze and stop like that. Just doesn't happen. They're going to continue moving. So you could put, for example, gloves on someone, boxing gloves and headgear, and have them go light, but still give them some sort of realistic energy that would in some way mimic what would happen to you if you happen to have to defend yourself on the sidewalk. But that's never what they do. It's always it never goes beyond that fantasy based demonstration. That's a more complicated question in the sense that there's different histories for different martial arts from around the world. So I have to really generalize and talk about one basic theme that I think happens over and over again. But once the martial arts ceases to be necessary, right? So when there's no longer a battlefield where people are using swords or actually tripping each other all the time, and everything is gone to muskets and firearms, if there's no sport aspect to that martial art, then it very quickly tends to devolve into what I call dead patterns, which are just fixed dead patterns that get repeated over and over again. And if there's no sport and there's no actual wartime use and people aren't training for that, then it basically just becomes a tradition. And in a very short period of time, a matter of decades, the real art gets lost because the people who are really functional with it aren't around anymore. So you can really see that in Japanese jiu-jitsu. So Japanese jiu-jitsu was a battlefield art that was a warrior culture. They had warlords fighting each other and using jiu-jitsu for you know for life or death. And then peacetime comes, and some of the art survives through a sporting context, and it eventually becomes judo. But after World War II, most Japanese jiu-jitsu in Japan basically became a fixed pattern where someone would, pretend to punch you, or they would grab your shirt and you would memorize a bunch of wrist locks. But there was no aliveness. The only part of that had aliveness was judo, because judo became a sport. But it was a sport focused primarily on just the takedown part of jujitsu. So the judoka got very good at the takedowns. The people who learned Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, who created Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, were learned it from the Japanese before that happened. So prior to World War II, they get that delivery system, and then in a place like Brazil, they're actually fighting all the time. One-on-one combat, mutual combat. People would watch. Nobody gets involved. Just the nature of the culture. Um, and in that petri dish of Brazil, over the course of 60 years, this art redevelops. And I have no doubt that um, the really good, Japanese warriors of 100 years before that probably were doing the exact same thing, but it redevelops in Brazil and evolves into what we have now. And now it's here in the United States, and continues to change through mixed martial arts. But the delivery systems of combat evolve based on adaptive pressures. And if there's no real adaptive pressure from a sport, and there's no actual application in the battlefield, they very quickly, I think, become dead patterns. So that's my generalized answer to that question. As far as Bruce Lee, he was an inspiration to many people, including me. And I love Bruce Lee. He was the reason why I got into martial arts. He was light years ahead of his time. He was advocating mixed martial arts and a kind of utilitarian approach. He had a saying he borrowed from Mao, but which is a good saying, which is absorb what is useful, reject what is useless, and add what is specifically your own. And he was using Western boxing with elements of kung fu and French kickboxing and jujitsu on the ground, and kind of putting it together. So in that sense, he was a real innovator. As far as a real fighter, I think he was a movie star who died at age 33. And so, had a very limited time to be able to train the way we train now, or you know, learn what he could have learned had he gone on. But what he was personally capable of or not, I think is almost unimportant in relation to his innovation in the martial arts and his inspiration to so many people like myself. I'll tell you a Krav Maga story that maybe will illustrate my point better. I have, over the years, had people come to me to take privates or train because they're getting ready for an instructor test. And one of the higher level instructor tests that you take to reach one of the higher levels of instructor in that art involves things that look a lot like mixed martial arts. They have to spar, they have to do certain things. So they would come to me and they'd say, well, I said, well, what's the test? And he would tell it to me, and it's somewhat similar to mixed martial arts, certain amount of rounds, stand up, clinch, and ground, all that kind of stuff. So I say, well, let's see what your root skill is. Like, where are you at? And I'll have him do a little bit of boxing with one of my guys that has decent boxing, not a great boxer, just decent. Stand up is usually minimal and rough. Let's train on the ground. Let's see where you're at on the ground. And typical 3-stripe white belt, let alone blue belt from Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, can dominate them on the ground. Someone much smaller. And unless they have a wrestling background, they're not going to have any of that. So I'm saying, okay, so you're coming to me to learn these mixed martial arts tests, but you don't really have any skill yet in mixed martial arts. And I'll take them through the real fundamentals of stand-up, clinch, and ground. This is how you move and throw a jab cross. This is how you escape a guillotine, that kind of thing. Sprawl. And inevitably, they'll go back, they'll take the test, they'll email me, they'll be very grateful, they pass with flying colors. But the whole time I'm thinking, you're getting dominated over and over again by somebody who's got like 18 months of training in the gym, and you've been training this year after year. That in and of itself should tell you something. So the constant drumbeat of fights, street fighting is different from sports, is often a very um, misleading and disingenuous form of marketing. Because when all is said and done, if you get attacked and you wind up on your back in the pavement, there's no magical parking lot escape we use. Your escape from mount position or your escape from a headlock is going to be exactly what you're trying to do here in the gym, whether you're wearing a jacket or MMA or sport jiu-jitsu or in the street. There are certain things we have to be aware of, but your functional skill, your ability to strike, to be able to stay on your feet, to take down, to fight on the ground, that doesn't change. Those root movements, those functional mechanics that define somebody who's good or not good are the same. And so, intelligently, what you should do, I think, is want to train those delivery systems and get as good as possible as you can. Avoid street fights, but get as good as you can at those delivery systems, and you'll have more than enough functional skill to be able to deal with somebody that doesn't know what they're doing or somebody in the street. I'll just be honest with you. I know where you're going, I think, but I'm a father of 5 kids, and I have 2 daughters. And my main concern for my kids and my daughters is that they can defend themselves. And I'm training them in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. Listen, if you're in a situation where you can't run away, that's because somebody's grabbing you. Somebody's hanging on to you. If somebody's hanging on to you, they're in our world. There is nothing that you're going to find on planet Earth that I've ever seen that's going to be better to teach you or my daughters or anybody else how to deal with someone who's trying to hang on to them than Gracie Jiu-Jitsu, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, which is what we do. If they're not hanging on to you, they're not trying to hold you down, you should run away. There's very few circumstances where you would ever want to square up with someone in the street and fight MMA. So from a purely practical standpoint of being able to defend yourself in the street, I think Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu is the most important thing. And people will always talk about, well, what if there's multiple opponents? There's no good way to fight multiple opponents. Like, could you fight 2 of yourself? No. You want to be able to get back to your feet and get away. What if there's a knife? You should never defend against, there's no good way to defend against a knife. People who are teaching people how to defend empty hand against a knife are doing a massive and dangerous misservice. So if you're at that level where you're really truly worried about getting attacked by 3 or 4 people or people that have knives and stuff like that, then you also need to get a gun. So now you need to get some functional firearms training and spend time at the range and spend time with being able to hang on to your weapon and retain it and draw it under fire and all that kind of stuff. And Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. And now we're talking about a truly functional system for a dangerous world. But nowhere in there do I think somebody needs to go spend 3 hours a day practicing to poke somebody in the eyes or, having to work grabbing somebody's groin over and over again. All the kind of stuff that those kind of people profit off of when they try and make that distinction. And I'll just say, it's marketed much the same way as people try and market martial arts and relate them somehow to the SEALs. There's no real relation there between the military and the martial art. The Navy SEALs don't have an official program, but as soon as you start attaching a military, that's just another disingenuous form of marketing most of the time. So as soon as anyone hears used by the Navy SEALs or used by the Israeli army or anything like that, then that right away should be a red flag, because no, it's not, probably.
Gotcha. Thank you.
You're welcome.
It is, though, amazing marketing. It's amazing branding.
It's amazing marketing, especially if you're marketing towards people who are scared and need martial arts, which also makes it a little more worthy of contempt. I don't want to go too far down that rabbit hole, but let me just offer this. The most important thing when it comes to that kind of training is your ability to present the weapon when it's necessary and to be able to hang on to it, in addition to being able to use it. And your hands are in front of your body. And so the first place I'd want to put that gun is somewhere that's super close to my hands and somewhere that close to my body I could defend. And if I have to make a motion like this, which separates my arm from my rib cage and also makes it really obvious what I'm doing, then it's going to be be more unlikely that I'm going to want to carry in that particular place. So you'll find a lot of people just will do an appendix carry or carry here in front of them because your hands are in front of you. If somebody reaches, first of all, they wouldn't know I had a weapon. But if they did and they're reaching, your hands are right there so that you can hand fight and you can maintain control of your weapon, which is super important. So, but there's so many different circumstances, and depending on your job and what you're doing at the time and what gear you wear and all that kind of stuff, that can change. But I would just say, you want to practice being able to hang on to it. And I think a lot of times when people start doing that kind of practice and doing a lot of that work, they find they prefer the weapon right here. The more ridiculous the martial art is, the more likely they are to want to attach something spiritual to it. And it's particularly a good seller when they can attach it to some form of Asian mysticism and things like that. And that's super common in the martial arts. And one of the criticisms people will make about people who train the way I do is that we've taken the quote unquote spiritual part out of the martial art because we're just focused only on the functional aspect. And I think it's very important for people to realize that's actually backwards. Because when you take the functional part of martial arts out, you're taking the part out that's actually going to develop confidence and well-being and all the great self-actualization lessons people learn come as a result of having to tap out, having to lose, having to physically confront your ego over and over and over and over. If you get a black belt in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, you're going to have to submit like thousands of times, meaning you've physically had to tap out to your partner, who in many cases is probably going to be smaller than you, or it's just the nature of the beast, because you can't get better without doing that. Just like if you're going to be a good striker, you're going to have to get hit in the face over and over again. There's no way to become a great boxer and not get hit. There's no way to become a great wrestler and not get taken down over and over and over again. And it is that process that renders people all of the things that people like to call spiritual, which I prefer to use something simple like self-actualization. Those are there in if you're training in a competitive functional martial art where people are mature. It's just a natural process of what happens. Now, once you take that out, once you take everything that's real about it out to where there is no longer have that daily confrontation with your own ego, then you're just left with the fantasy-based stuff, which you have to try and defend over and over again. And there's nothing spiritually miraculous about that. That's not gonna help people. So it's actually backwards, number one. And anytime somebody attaches a lot of any kind of mysticism, but to a martial art, that would also be a red flag to me, because it's generally associated with make-believe martial arts. As far as sports, there isn't that level of fake spirituality in combat sports, but there is a kind of an unspoken understanding amongst people that have trained a long time that you're going to be put in altered states of consciousness sometimes and have to learn how to navigate or work with those kind of things, like being in the zone and all that kind of stuff that comes with, again, testing your body. And again, that's something that happens naturally, and it's something that's real. So, there's nothing really superstitious about people going through different states of consciousness while they physically tax themselves. That's just what happens. Superstition wise, I don't see much superstition within the combat sports. There's some superstition with any athlete, but yeah, it's just, it's the main point I would like to get across to people is if they came to me and said, no, I really don't care about the fighting part. I really want to just train martial arts to better myself as a human being for self-actualization, I would immediately just put them in a combat sport. There you go. That's where it's going to happen.
When you talk about states of consciousness, what are you referring to?
I just mean that oftentimes people who will start training in jiu-jitsu will find that they really, really love the sparring part of it. They like rolling. And one of the things that happens when they're rolling is they tend to forget about all their problems at home or their daily anxiety, the subvocalization that many people spend a lot of time listening to over and over again as they talk to themselves in their head. And when you put yourself in a situation where you have to respond physically to someone real time on the mat, that kind of environment that happens naturally when you're rolling in jiu-jitsu, it becomes you tend to stop doing that after a while. It just becomes because you have to focus on what you're doing at the moment in time. I don't think there's anything particularly unique about jiu-jitsu. I think that occurs when people surf. I think that occurs when people ski. It happens, but that is a very pleasurable experience for a lot of people. It is a respite from the daily neurosis and anxiety that people have, and some people can use it as a launching point to go back to that place on a regular basis without having to be under that kind of physical stress. But even if they don't, I think that is one of the unspoken reasons why people find, jujitsu addictive in many ways.
Do you ever think there'll be a time when people just, and I'm asking because it's just such a test. We've talked a lot about testing in here, that people simply won't participate in these forms of mass delusion anymore, these martial arts that yield nothing?
I do not. I do not think there'll ever be a time for that. I think more likely is we'll have brief periods where less of the population does it, and those will disappear really quickly and be forgotten, and we'll go back to mass delusion. I think it's always a mix of both. I don't think money is the main motivator most of the time, even with the people who are teaching it. I mean, there's some that will do it in a purely mercenary way to take advantage of people. But I think more often than not, people's identity gets wrapped up in the activity. So if they've been doing some form of kung fu for 10 or 15 years, their identity is being such and such level in this art of kung fu or aikido or whatever it is. And it's a very difficult thing for us as human beings to invest amount of time like that and then have to realize, man, it's kind of nonsense, and let it go. And I've run into people over the years who've had that experience in front of me, or realized it in real time while I knew them, and some of them immediately drop the old and venture forth down a new path of what's real, which is I always find really admirable when people do that. And very often then people just kind of fade away and go back, and they either just do it with less vigor, or they just continue on doing what they were doing before. And unfortunately, I think that's a very unhealthy thing for people to do, because once you realize it's not true, if you then at that point decide to consciously keep doing it, I don't think that does good things for people mentally and physically, but it happens. So I just think, and it's not just martial arts, I think in anything, for us to realize, man, that was a waste of time, and just to be able to let it go, it's hard. And the moment your identity becomes wrapped up in it, it's 10 times harder. And martial arts really is something that people's identity gets attached to, especially young men or males, because we're talking about fighting, and fighting is a primal thing. It's like violence and fighting, and it's right up there with sex and reproduction. It's one of those things that's primal. And what man doesn't want to think he can fight or can't defend himself given the circumstance? So the moment their identity becomes tied up in this thing that says that they can do this thing that's really primal, that our ancestors found necessary to do over and over again, then it's even harder to let go of. Is it a red flag for me? For me personally, it's a red flag, because I can't do that. I don't want to teach fantasy-based martial arts alongside functional martial arts. Some people have no problem with that, and their rationalization is, well, I'm going to give people what they want, and then they can decide. And if they want to do something practical, we've got kickboxing class at 7 p.m. If they want to do something silly, they can do Aikido class at 6 p.m. or whatever it is. And that's not uncommon. There's a lot of people that do that. More often than not, that is a business decision, because then they have more classes and more products and more curriculum that they can sell to people. But for me personally, I wouldn't want to do that. And the way I would view it as a student is in this way. Your most precious commodity is your time, and most of us don't have that many hours a week we can train. Realistically, if you have a job or school or a family, and you're going to have maybe 4 hours a week if you're lucky that you can really train hard. What do you want to spend that 4 hours on? It takes a lifetime to become good at one aspect of functional martial arts, to become truly good on the ground, to be very good at Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. Will take the average human about 15 years. And that's 15 years of training 3 or 4 days a week. And then they're at the start of where I would say they're now ready to learn. Like, because when you get your black belt in Jiu-Jitsu, I think you realize, okay, now I'm actually at the point where I can really start learning the art. And so combine that with stand-up, if you wanted to learn how to strike, and with the clinch, which is just as complicated, if not more so, as the ground is. Where on earth would there be time for me to click sticks together or practice against someone who's pretending to chop me in the head? I mean, that part of it I don't get. My time is precious, and I want to use it on things that I think are functional.
I'll ask a question. Do you have any regrets from spending so much time on this? Yeah.
No. I mean, the things I've been able to see and do, and the people I've been able to meet just because of my job, is kind of, when I think back on it, I just don't feel anything but gratitude. I mean, I've been able to travel all over the world and go to really weird, obscure places, have all kinds of crazy, incredible experiences, because wherever I go, people want to share their stuff with me, whatever their job is or thing that they do. And I get treated like a guest, and it's been that way for 30 years. I can't feel anything but grateful.
It's a good life to have led. I'm always amazed and I'm not saying this is universal or always, but I have been really taken aback by when it's called rolling, when I've, wrestled with people, how no one is, especially as they get better, like tried to kill me. Like they've always been so gentle and so, and people who, I guess it's just when there's a corrective mechanism and there's something real, then you don't really feel a need to prove yourself if you already have it.
Yeah, and the people who would be inclined to want to hurt you get weeded out very early in the process, because
Exactly.
they're not willing to go through that process.
I rolled with Gunnar Nelson when he came to the gym a while ago. Holy shit, that was, wouldn't even call it rolling. I would just call it like, it was insane. I mean, it was just.
You realize that was 13 years ago?
Was it really?
Yeah, that was my wedding.
Wow, that was a long time ago. Yeah. Wow. One more thing I'll just throw out at you. I've had this idea for a long time. I'm wondering if constantly being in a position of being able to hurt someone and break their arm or what have you, choke them into unconscious, even kill them, actually. The very fact that you don't do that time and time again, literally every day, or just about every day, maybe you're the best one there, I think that must, to a certain extent, cultivate a virtuous habit in somebody.
Maybe. I haven't thought about it that way. But, the flip side of that is you train for a while and you start to realize you can't look at somebody and tell if they're dangerous or not.
That's the other thing I've learned from this.
Goonie doesn't necessarily look like a carnivore, but, he's awesome at what he does. So you learn to be, there's a certain level of, I guess, humility that comes with the fact that
Totally,
and you also realize fighting is always dangerous.
Who was that guy Goonie fought who looked like a monster and he got in his back?
Jeff Munson.
That was an insane fight, like a crazy fight.
If it's who I'm thinking of, Jeff's.
The guy with the tattoos all over him. He looked like a monster. Like he
He's
walked
actually. I just give a shout out to Jeff. He's actually a Pacific Northwest a legend. He's one of the original guys from this part of the country, and yeah, and Jeff's very good.
Oh yeah, no question. So I would just want to say something else, and then we'll close. You've been very generous with your time, and I appreciate talking to this. When the classes were on ground, I'd spend 5 or 6 weeks, and I have experts in various things. I had Mark Chrysalis came in and talked about just acupuncture. I had Brett and Heather come in and talk about evolutionary biology as it relates to creationism. I lined up guest lecturers, but the pandemic's been a little weird for that. I had Jamie in Swiss who was supposed to come in last week, but I'm curious that the final thing I want to say is, so you have no regrets. You've enjoyed it. One of the things that I've learned, and certainly I've done it not nowhere near as you, and I'm not very good, but it's really teaches you early on what you can't do.
Mm-hmm.
And that's such a valuable lesson. Like, because I think we see all these movies and there's a kind of like superstition. Oh, I'm going to beat up 5 guys with bats.
Mm-hmm.
No, you're not. You're not even going to beat up 1 guy maybe you get lucky with 1, but I just think that there's something unbelievably potent in knowing what you can't do.
Yeah. Well, that's very true. That's very true.
Cool. Thank you, Matt. I appreciate it.
Yeah. Thanks for having me. It's always a pleasure.